Welcome everybody to the YouTube channel of All Saints with Holy Trinity, the historic parish church of Loughborough. It's great to welcome you to our YouTube channel. If you've been here before, you will know that on a Tuesday lunchtime, I set aside some time to meet with 3 other colleagues, different preachers, some ordained, some lay preachers from different parts of the country, who all have one thing in common, and that is that they like to read the Bible and to expound upon it in different contexts, different church contexts, different Christian communities. The texts that we look at are taken from the Revised Common Lectionary, RCL for short, for those who like a good abbreviation. And the RCL is something that's shared by Christians of different denominations and traditions in different places all around the world, and over a 3-year cycle takes us through the great themes of the scripture. There's always a gospel reading, something from the Old Testament or Hebrew scriptures, as we might call them, and something from the epistles usually. There's also a psalm set in the lectionary. We don't tend to look at that here on the Muse just due to time, but just if you wanted to know that, there's always a psalm. So we take a look and we do a bit of open thinking as preachers, what strikes us in the text this week, but more than what strikes us, how might we preach the text? If you're with us live, do please join in the conversation. We love to include your comments and perspectives. How are you reacting to these readings? If you are preparing a sermon, what are you wrestling with as you try to craft something for this coming Sunday? So I can see that Sue's here and Rachel's here. Hi, great to have you with us. Do please join in and use the comments. But while I type up into the comments the readings that we're looking at today, my guests are going to introduce themselves, tell you a little bit about who they are and their context of the ministry, and share something about what they're looking forward to when all our restrictions are lifted. Oh, happy day, and we've all been jabbed up and so on. So thank you to my guests as I type up into the comments.
Thank you, Wendy. Lovely to be with you again. My name is Andrew Race. I am the vicar at Castle Donington with Lockington cum Hemmington, up in the shadow of East Midlands Airport and the new East Midlands Gateway. We are an area of outstanding growth. I wish it was outstanding natural beauty. It doesn't feel like that at the moment. We've got big warehouses going up all around us, and there's a huge house building program going on. So we've got all that dust and that noise, as well as the noise of the racetrack and the airport and the trains clickety-clacking by. So that's us. I'm too young to have had the vaccine, but there is a date in the diary later this week, I think, or maybe early next week, to have my first dose. And I'm really looking forward to 2 things, really. One is opening up church again for our in-person worship. We've just made a decision that we will do that at Pentecost. And then personally, we're just looking forward, I guess, like so many are, just to getting out again, getting out and about and visiting friends and family. So much to see, so much to look forward to.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm the Reverend Mark Poskett. I'm the rector of Bosworth Benefice, 7 rural villages, or 6 villages, I suppose, around the village-sized town of Market Bosworth here in rural Leicestershire. I wouldn't describe it as an area of natural beauty, but it's certainly a very nice area to live in, and I'm certainly blessed living here, so I'm very grateful for that. Of course, it's famed for the Battle of Bosworth and a certain king who was discovered under a car park in Leicester. So that's my background. I am old enough to have had my first jab, Andrew. Thank you very much for pointing that out. I had it on Saturday with no ill effects, and I would recommend everybody to get their jabs as soon as they are offered one. And I'm looking forward to, again, the freedom to move around, really. Our churches have predominantly been open when they've been allowed to be open, with restrictions, of course. But it is the other bits of life, isn't it? It's seeing family and friends, and I'm a Yorkshireman, and I love to go back to Yorkshire and go to the coast. So I really am looking forward to regaining that freedom of movement. I think that's the one thing that I'm really looking forward to at the moment.
Thank you, Mark. My name's Andy Smith. I'm a lay minister. I run my own business as a coach and consultant, and my ministry is based up in northwest Leicestershire, just down the road from Andrew, at the Flagstaff family of churches, based around Ashby de la Zouch. But one of our churches butts right up against Andrew's benefice, I think, at Breedon on the Hill. And I would say, having driven through your parish on Saturday to have my vaccine jab, I would certainly echo the fact that your area is no longer an area of outstanding natural beauty, Andrew. So yes, my wife Helen and I both had our jabs on Saturday, and I was astonishingly impressed at how well coordinated the whole process was. And there is absolutely nothing to fear about having the jab. The thing I'm looking forward to is actually really very, very personal, really. My sister lives just down the road from me, and unfortunately, just under a couple of months ago, she lost her husband and I lost my brother-in-law to COVID. We've been extremely dutiful, but we cannot wait to be able to give one another a big hug. And that's what we're looking forward to.
Thanks, Andy, and to all my guests. Yeah, and I'm Wendy, rector of a town centre church, and I too am too young to have had the jab yet. However, I am next on the list, so and I'm looking forward to getting it done. And I think, like you just reflected, Andy, I can't wait to see my grandson, who is 2.5, and there's nothing that, you know, FaceTime just doesn't cut it when you want to have cuddles and kisses with a little boy. So yeah, and we always start there because we bring all of our context into our preaching, both our sermon preparation and into the lives of our congregations and the people we're communicating with. So we bring all of that into the text. I will just say hello to Michelle and Chris and Bob and Vanessa who checked in. And Sue says, I've had many a coffee at the services in Donington Park. It's the perfect stop off halfway to York. So there you go. Sue, meet Andrew. Andrew meets Sue. Maybe we can hook you up together sometime. Right, we're going to dive in with our passages. We begin, as we always do, with the gospel reading. So we're in John chapter 12. And the lectionary kind of takes us into, I guess, all the stuff that's in the run-up to Holy Week. So the tension is mounting. This is Jesus's last sort of public teaching, really. And we start with this, some Greeks who want to see Jesus. And then Jesus speaks about his death. Andrew, I think you were going to kick us off with the gospel.
Thank you, Wendy, for that introduction. And yes, this is one of the passages where Jesus predicts his death and is a precursor to what is to come. And it's like so many of the passages from John, I find at least, is that there's several layers to each of the passages. And in a sense, we don't have time this morning to kind of explore all the different layers. And as a preacher, I guess on my heart is to unlock the passage and to find those key points that might be helpful. And I suppose I've sort of identified 4 of the many that there are. So these are just 4 particular keys. And so forgive me if I don't address them all, or forgive me if they seem to be the wrong ones. We bring our own lenses to this as well, which I'm very conscious of as a preacher. I was told early on in my preaching career that there's only one person that you prepare a sermon for, and that's usually yourself. So forgive me if this seems a little self-indulgent. It's not meant to be. It's meant to be just exploring, I suppose, our wrestlings with Scripture and with God. So the first thing is, and it's a line that Wendy, you pointed out already, you know, now there were some Greeks among those who came to worship at the festival. And it's interesting, why does John refer to Greeks? Because it's a matter of lines and then they disappear from the story. And then, of course, the first thing that Jesus then says is, the hour has come. Up to that point in John's gospel, there are 3 or 4 occasions where Jesus says in certain contexts, my hour has not come. And so what happens? Why has he changed his mind? Well, of course, in the progression of the story, we're reaching the crescendo, aren't we? But I think there's something in here about the presence of the Greeks that draws our attention to the fact that the gospel of Jesus Christ is for all people, not just the Jewish nation. the saving purpose of God are available to all people. And it's as if the world has turned up, in John's language, to see who this man is. The world is waiting and ready and listening. And Jesus takes this moment to say, the hour has now come. You are all watching. And I guess there's a question to us there. Are we watching? Are we ready to listen? Are we ready to hear? Are we ready to receive? And then Jesus goes into kind of what he has to say. And at face value, it's a little bit complex, it's a little bit contradictory. And there are some paradoxes that Jesus leads us into about life with him and life with God. I guess they're paradoxes rather than contradictions, because through what appears to be one thing, there's a deeper meaning and a deeper truth. And through those paradoxes, Jesus wants to communicate something of what the essence of life with God is all about. And he mentions three. There's the first about the wheat. You know, in order for the plant to grow, the seed must die. And then that leads into a deeper paradox about our own lives. And whether we choose our life or choose to serve. And there's a paradox in there, and there's some fairly strong language that we need to be careful, I guess, not to be confused by. Anyone who loves their life will lose it, while anyone who hates their life in this world will keep it. We need to be mindful of storytelling techniques of the time. I think this might be one of those things referred to as Semitic hyperbole. It's a technique to get our attention, rather than say, why is he talking about love and hate? Two very polarized things. What's going on here? He wants us to get to the nub of it, to draw our attention that there's something to the life with God that is not about our self-centeredness, but about laying down our lives, serving one another, which of course is exactly what Jesus does. And with a couple of caveats to that paradox. And then the third paradox is that those who lay down their lives, those who serve, God honors. You know, God works through. God does something amazing. So that's what Jesus is wanting to kind of draw to our attention is how God works through the paradoxes of life. You know, new life, and life comes from that which dies, that which is laid down. However, he also draws to our attention the human element to it, and that is we wrestle with these things, and that's just kind of part of the process. When we engage with God, we might be reminded of that story of Jacob by the stream, that Old Testament story where he comes away with wrestling with someone in the night and he comes away with a limp. Well, we wrestle with the letting go of me. It's natural, it's human. And in the wrestling, we learn to let go and let God. Part of that wrestling is that we can be troubled in our spirit. We can be troubled in our soul. Jesus was troubled. John refers, now he says, now my soul is troubled. He doesn't talk about the Gethsemane experience. We read that in the other Gospels, but this is John just acknowledging that Jesus was troubled. There's something that we wrestle that's disturbing, that's unsettling in this paradoxical process of drawing close to God. But when we do, my fourth point is that God honors that third paradox. God honors that. And we read in the scripture about this voice glorifying Jesus. And we have this word glory, which is, I find, quite a difficult word to understand. I think the settled view I've come just at this point is that the term glory refers something to the characteristic of God that he bestows in Israel. Jesus, you are my son. And that characteristic of God then gets bestowed on us through his saving grace. So that's my entry into John.
Brilliant. Wonderful. I love that. And what I'm very struck by as I listen to you, Andrew, is being attentive to the pastoral situation of preaching. And sometimes, if we talk about this a lot on the Muse, if we just lift a text and don't give any context, it can be quite unhelpful to people. And I'm almost also very much struck this year. Lots of us know about death this year. either very immediate death, but we also know about the death of opportunity, the death of, so you don't have to think very hard to help people understand about loss this year at all. And I'm guessing that plays into our sermon preparation when we come to a text like this. Let me come to the wisdom from the north. Mark, as you kind of read the gospel and as you listen to Andrew sort of share what he's really drawn to as he comes to this, what reflections do you have?
Well, I thought Andrew did a very good job, to be frank. And those four messages were very much a lot of what I've written down here. I think other things I'd sort of pull out of it were the sort of the bookmarking of this passage as well. You talked about the Greeks coming to speak to Jesus, and then of course verse 32 ends with that: "When I am lifted up, I'll draw all people to myself." There's a natural bookmarking to this passage as well, which I think is just, I mean, it might be just it might just be an author thing that happened, but it seems to bookmark itself. It's very significant. It's a very defining, transformative moment. And I compare it as well to that passage in Luke 9 when Jesus turns his face to Jerusalem. There is a defining change in Jesus. Up to this point, he's been very much teaching, healing, being with the disciples and helping them to understand his message and everything else about him. But there is a moment in which, in a sense, it becomes less about the disciples and more about him. Do you know what I mean? It's almost a focus becomes Jesus himself, and now we're entering to his passion. Of course it is. We're getting towards Passion Tide. So I think that's very significant in the way that this is bookmarked as well. It's a defining passage in John. And the other thing I do find quite intriguing about this is one of those little intriguing things that I notice is the way that there's a transmission, a chain of communication.
Yes.
It's a chain of communication from the Greeks to Philip, who they perhaps thought, because he was from where was he from? I've forgotten. Bethsaida. So they assumed they could speak to Philip, and then Philip speaks to Andrew, and Andrew and Philip then go to Jesus together. And it's a little bit like the feeding of the 5,000, where Philip's asked, how are we going to feed all these people? I haven't got a clue. Andrew comes on, well, there's a boy here with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Oh, well, let's do something of that then, sort of thing. So there's a sort of a chain of communication, which I find intriguing. It's almost like this is a very deep, very significant, transformative passage, yet within it there's this little strand of humanity and how the disciples, how their relationship with Jesus works out. Philip's too afraid to go, but Andrew says, oh, come on, we'll go together and let's go and talk to Jesus together. And I think there's that element to it which I quite like. And I love in John, because for all its heaviness and all its layers, there is just these little snippets. It's like the little phrase, Jesus wept. There's these little phrases, and this humanity that's brought out in here is so touching, so deeply touching as well. And of course, it calls to mind Jesus's obedience, and yet Jesus, of course, was obedient anyway. It's not questioning whether he'd been obedient up to that point. It's the fact that he was, in submitting himself to what was to happen, he was being honoured and glorified by God. And I think so. There's just sort of wonderful snippets within this passage, which I really love and could dwell on for quite a long time, really.
Thanks, Mark. And actually, Vanessa earlier on in the comments had said she wondered if, did they go to Philip because they felt he'd be more approachable, because Philip's a Greek name, isn't it? And there was that. And I suppose you could take a sermon that is around the relationality stuff, and how do we bring people to Jesus, and how does all that get communicated, and so on. And Sue made a comment about glory. She says, I think God's concept of glory is so different from ours. The utter degradation of the cross to humans is glory as God sees it, because those awful hours are utterly transfigured by love. Thank you for that, Sue. Andy, what are your reflections on this passage?
Well, I have to say, Andrew and Mark have done really well, haven't they? 10 out of 10. I think the thing I'd pick up on, it's something that Andrew mentioned as one of his 4 points, but it's this whole notion of the paradoxes that Jesus talks about, but then that we also see at the cross and following the events of the cross. So this whole notion of having to die to give life, and John is such a great storyteller. This really does have the sense that the tempo and the pace and the tension ramps up in this Sunday moving through Lent. And for me, there's this complete contrast between our current expectation of heroes and storytelling, where whatever series we're currently binging on Netflix or iPlayer or whatever to get us through the next fortnight of lockdown, right at the last minute, against all impossible odds, the hero pulls the rabbit out of the hat. And in our story, actually, that doesn't appear to happen. But because of these fantastic paradoxes, the end is not the end, and it's a death which gives life. And I've really got this whole notion of Jesus emptying himself and giving all in order to gain everything. And I think there's just something really, really powerful in all of those that again, a preacher could explore.
Thank you. I noticed in the comments that Rachel has sort of centered quite a bit on is unpicking the death stuff, and talks about when stuff dies, it's really gross, there's a smell, it's unpleasant and painful. And in fact, Rachel noticed earlier in the comments, of course, this comes after the death and then the resurrection of Lazarus. We're just in the chapter afterwards. So that's the wider community context to Jesus sort of having this conversation, and something around actually that change takes time. So Rachel says, for me, a talk which focuses on how immediate change is unrealistic and that we need sustained and gradual grief, growth and rebirth. So the death to life. I might even go with the Doctor Who analogy, actually. When Doctor Who regenerates, it takes a while. That might not be the most topical example, actually. It's not really on at the minute. But I suppose there's an element of that this is not... there's process in this, isn't there? This isn't magic cat stuff. This isn't... the big reveal in that sense, I guess. We've spent a lot of time on that, and I think we will come back to it, but let's just move through our other passages and see how these speak into each other. This is, as we said, we're kind of in the lectionary, there's a real movement towards taking us to Holy Week, taking us towards what that will all mean, and we'll come back to that when we look at Hebrews in a moment. But our Old Testament text, or Hebrew text, is from Jeremiah 31, verses 31 to 34. It's headlined in my Bible, A New Covenant. So spoiler alert, that's kind of what it's about. And it comes in the section of Jeremiah, which is all of the joyful return of the exiles. I think it's not sure whether they are in exile and it's being written, or whether they're not in exile yet. But it's looking forward to a time when they're not. And of course, as Christians, we read this already with it being referenced throughout the New Testament. But actually, it also has its own original context and meaning too. I think, Andy Smith, you were going to kick us off with a bit of Jeremiah.
Well, I was, Wendy, but you've just taken up about 80% of what I was going to say about the passage, So.
Oh, well, there you go. Go on then. Bring us your wisdom.
Well, I guess the first thing as well is just to say that I think, in common with a lot of people who preach and have studied the prophets, this is one of my favorite pieces of Jeremiah. It comes in the book of consolation, or the book of comfort, and kind of 30 chapters into Jeremiah, you actually need a bit of consolation and comfort. I remember when I was studying it, doing my reader training, doing Isaiah in one week followed by Jeremiah the next week, very nearly broke me. And this is one of the passages, along with one other passage in Isaiah, which kind of convinced me that maybe it was worth going on. And I think it's actually quite important, if I was preaching on this and using this as the main part of the text, to remind people that this was written for a people who were not Christians. So while we immediately naturally come at it with our experience of the resurrection, actually it merits understanding that this was written for a people either still in exile or recently returned from exile. And it's a new covenant, but there is a continuity as well. So the new covenant continues the character of God's love for a fallen people. And that what is new about it is how that is actually enacted and brought to life. So the old covenant was externalized. And I think there are some interesting images perhaps to draw in terms of the tablets of stone and the scrolls of the law. So the tablets of stone were broken, the scrolls of the law shut away in the Ark of the Covenant, whereas the new covenant, I absolutely love this. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God and they will be my people. It's etched in us. It's etched in our DNA, and because of that, everyone has this relationship with God. They're not reliant on a hierarchy or a legal institution in order to contact God. And then in time, in and through Jesus, the God of Jeremiah continues to forgive and to renew and to reform and call us into a right relationship with him. And the other thing as well, just thinking at the moment, clearly there are in terms of institutions, so going back to this contrast with the old institutional religion, as we stand up, or some of you will stand up and preach on Sunday. Obviously, the last year has seen our institutions really tested and tried, and in some instances found wanting. Clearly, the Metropolitan Police is under enormous scrutiny at the moment, and the whole Sussexes versus the royal family saga continues to rumble on. And I just find it really interesting that under all of those institutions, there's this element of power and hierarchy, and this new covenant actually drives a coach and horses through that notion. And my final observation, I think, would link back to the passage that Mark, certainly the verse that Mark picked up on from the gospel, where Jesus says, "I will draw all people to myself." And I just see this kind of completing the loop with God writing onto our hearts and our minds his love, and then Jesus drawing us back into that with the events on the cross. So that's what I would kind of run with, I think, at the moment.
Thank you. As you were talking, I called to mind, I think it was yesterday, John Bell at the Iona community was doing Thoughtful Day on Radio 4. Yes, I do listen to Radio 4. But he spoke brilliantly in the way that only John Bell can, really, about how, in terms of challenging the sin of male violence, as our Archbishop has phrased it, that it's not just legislation, and you can't, change happens not just by laws but by the individual's heart, and we're all complicit in that. And I don't know whether I would get a sermon from this text in that way, but as you were speaking, Andy, that's what came to my mind. I thought that was a really powerful way of understanding, if we're going to have any change of any sort, tackling racism, sexism, etc., you can't just do it by laws that are over here. It's transformation of the heart. And Chris says in the comments, knowledge of God is written on everyone's hearts. Some folk choose not to learn to read it. I like that, Chris. Thank you for that. That's quite a nice, How do we read God in our own hearts? Might be a place where we start. Andrew, as you come to this text, what strikes you, or what do you want to reflect back on?
Yeah, I guess I'm reminded slightly that Jeremiah was speaking into an understanding of law needing to be obeyed and followed, and if it wasn't, you were punished. And so there's something going on here which is a foretaste of what Jesus brings to the equation, if you wish, of moving away from this culture of punishment and blame and retribution to a different way of being. Now, I think that kind of whole notion of punishment was theologically to do with drawing people to repentance rather than simply, slapping their wrist because they've been naughty. And the old covenant was involved not just God's side of the bargain, but our side of the bargain. And of course, as human beings, we fail again and again and again to meet our side of the bargain in the old covenant speak sense, And so God does something about it. And this is his promise, that he's going to do something about it, to write something new on our hearts. The text very unhelpfully doesn't say what that is. I suspect it might have something to do with the golden rule, about love, and that it is love that transforms. I think Andy, one of you, has touched on it already. So I think this is really interesting, and God is wishing to rework his affirmation of us through his love and through that sense of relationship, and that's what the cross of Jesus offers us.
Yeah, thank you. And I suppose there's something about you could, I suppose, think about, what does God need to write on our hearts now? What is it that we need to embrace and to hear? Mark, you're looking wonderfully pensive, thoughtful.
It's my natural look. I thank you for all your comments. I think I agree entirely. I think the context of Jeremiah is so important as well, and this is a very challenging, very insecure time for the people of Judah. Lots of changes have been going on. Josiah has tried to implement the Deuteronomic law back into society. Then he's lost his life, and then they're effectively in their own lockdown, aren't they? And then they're heading out into exile. So in a sense, all the sort of things that they understood well, the rules and the regulations, the structures and the frameworks of society, are all being pulled away from them, being torn down. And there's only this one, almost like one glimmer of hope, isn't it? And it's the thing about Jeremiah, you're quite right to say, Andy, it's a wonderful book, but it can get you down if you don't know the overall theme, really. But it's this wonderful hope, this seed. When we talk about John and the death of the seed to create a new thing, and this seed, this hope, is a new covenant which is written on our hearts, and so that the physicalness of what's around us doesn't matter anymore, because God will write his love, his message in our hearts, and will respond in our hearts. So I think there's a contextual element to all of this as well, which I think really fits in nicely with what you both have been saying. And I think the other thing I was going to say on it was also that this sort of conflict between imposed rules and the rule of love on our hearts. And I as with Wendy, we sit in the area deans meetings. We have lots of discussions about various regulations, church representation rules, buildings, graveyard regulations, and I sit there, and as Wendy probably knows, I sit there often with my head in my hands thinking, that's not why we're here. And, we are here supporting an institution which has its own rules and regulations, when actually we are called to love and to show compassion and to proclaim the message of the good news of Jesus Christ. And I just really, as much as I know it, and perhaps of my experience helps me work with it, there are so many elements of our area deans meetings where our dear Archdeacon, if you're listening, Archdeacon Claire, you'll know I'm going to say this. She'll say something, I just go, no, I'm not going to be doing that. I'm just going to get on with the work. Thank you very much. What I'm here for is to be a parish priest to my benefit and my people. And, whether if the registrar wants a particular piece of paper, well, he might get it. I mean, I've got all the church warden decorations sat on my landing up here, which was supposed to do for last year's church wardens. They've all made the declarations, but I haven't sent them back yet. Nobody's asked for them, so there you go.
Let it out, Mark. Ministers Muse also doubling up as therapy for area deans this week. I think you touched on something very real, though, Mark, don't you? That we're all grappling with institutions, and actually it kind of like takes us away from what we think we're about. And as you were talking, I was wondering if there's a connection here with the gospel reading and the thing about dying and what we need to die to. And we, particularly as a church institution, actually our rules kind of, I don't know, they protect us, or they make us safe, and maybe what do we need to let go of, what do we need to die to there, to live to in Jesus. Although I should be very careful and say that I shall not die to the Church of England representation rules. But yes, implementation. Anyway, we're going to move on.
Why did you say that, Wendy, as interim chair of House of Clergy?
Anyway, Andy, I noticed you had your hand up. Do you have something to bring us back to the
just before all three. Well, Andrew's keeping very quiet. I noticed, clearly the politician amongst the three of you. It did just strike me again, coming back to the notion of dying, and the seed has to die in order to give life. again, whether that's a possible avenue. I mean, we're quite a long way into Lent. One of the traditional things around the start of Lent is, what are you going to give up? And, we sort of give up Cadbury's dairy milk for 6 weeks, like that's going to save the world. And here, actually, what in our life needs to die, again, raises the level of that question really, really significantly. It's not about giving up something on the periphery. What is it at the heart of us? Perhaps what's obscuring that message that's written on our heart and preventing us from reading it. It's asking us to revisit ourselves and our lives on a completely different level, from a completely different perspective.
Yeah.
There's also a bigger story of hope there as well, Andy, in a sense, not just what needs to die, but what's going to die anyway. And of course, we're wrestling with that as institutions right now. And that reference to rescuing from the land of Egypt, now to rescue from the land of Babylon. Chaos is all around us. And we're wrestling with that on the one hand, and yet there's this hope through it all. God will rescue us and God will restore us.
Yeah.
And it wasn't the politician keeping silent. I was just doodling with my pen quietly.
Shall we move on?
I've probably wrongfully offended Andrew now.
Right, I'm going to bring us back to task. Right, so sorry, folks listening at home. We're going to land now and move on to the third of the passages. We may reference Jeremiah again. Our epistle comes from Hebrews. All of my guests drew straws and nobody wanted Hebrews, which seems a little harsh. But anyway, Hebrews 5, verses 5 to 10, where we get reference to this peculiar character of Melchizedek, who gets a little bit part in Genesis, and Christ is described as a priest according to the order of Melchizedek. Mark, you were delighted to draw the short straw on this one, so bring us your wisdom on this Hebrews text.
Do you know, I wish I could bring you some wisdom on it, Wendy, but I'm not sure I will, but I'll give you what I've got. Yes, first of all, Hebrews, it's one of those, it's a wonderful letter, actually, when you start reading it through, the whole letter. I mean, we don't know who the author was, we're not entirely sure who the audience was. It's a Jewish diaspora, but it's actually a wonderful letter. When you start reading, this is my blurb, but it starts off with the Son is superior to the angels and the exaltation through abasement. There are some wonderful themes in Hebrews, and of course that lovely message about hope as well. It's a wonderful book to actually delve into, even though it sort of sits in between the pastoral letters and the Peter and the Johns and everything else. It's one of those which sort of you ignore it at peril to some degree, but it's quite hard letter as well to get into and really sort of grapple with and to try to draw anything out of, and that's why I got the short straw. This passage from Hebrews 5 is a lovely little passage, actually, quite a short passage, but it does refer to so many of the themes we've already been talking about. Christ did not glorify himself in becoming a high priest, but was appointed by the one who said to him, "You are my son, today I've begotten you." It's that same reckoning as in John, where Jesus did not assume his position, but he submitted himself to the calling of God to follow through his passion, to die on the cross for all people. There's that sense again of Christ having emptied himself in order to be fully and wholly obedient to God. And I think that's something for us all to be learning in our own lives, in which, we have those callings in our own lives, but how do we respond to them? Do we sort of set them to one side? Do we really objectively sort of focus on them and really make a difference in our lives? I'm thinking about my calling as a cleric, what that moment when I knew God was saying to me, right, make that phone call now, is a moment when you've got to sort of do something about it, isn't it? So Christ did not glorify himself. He took the form of a servant, and yet he was blessed as being a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek, old Melchi, who is this legendary priest king of Old Testament times, and not just a character in Blackadder. So I think if you want to look at Melchizedek, please do, because there is a little bit Robin Hoodish he's mentioned, but there's not a lot said about him. But what is said is significant, and what it implies about Christ himself is also very, very significant. So look up Melchizedek for yourselves. That's your homework for the week. And again, we are back to, in the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications, again going back to the Garden of Gethsemane, and this anxiety and distress in this human anxiety and distress, which we all feel in times of stress, but Christ himself felt as well, as he knew, once the Greeks had been to ask for him, that he was called to follow this particular path. And the distress he must have felt is enormous. I mean, we've been doing the Lent book, we've been doing the book, The Things He Carried by Stephen Cottrell, part of our Lent course. And as we listen to Stephen Cottrell's sort of accounts or in writing about the different elements, particularly the cross and the pain and the agony and the distress of the cross, it makes you start to appreciate just what Jesus was really going through in the Garden of Gethsemane, what this is referring to, that deep, deep, deep distress that perhaps we never fully get to, but we know part of in our own lives. And although he was a son, he learned obedience. Jesus, of course, was obedient. He was, we have to remember, is the Christ of the Trinity. So, and the Trinity of love, living in love together in perfect submission to one another. He was always obedient. But this is obedience of a different level or scale. It's a submission to. It's an obedience through submission to a calling he's felt, which again perhaps is something as of those who are minister to people, we perhaps feel the obedience has to overcome our own selfish desires, go off and do something completely different. There is a real tension there between our humanity and our calling, and I think that's something that Jesus himself was also having to grapple with in this moment. But because he fulfilled it, then he was called into this legendary status of being a priest as the order of Melchizedek. So it's a lesson really about his absolute obedience to God, revealing, of course, the distress of his humanity as well. We mustn't ever forget his humanity alongside his divinity. And as I say, those occasions when we perhaps have to face much lesser trials in our own lives, but are called to be obedient, and yet obedience itself is not blind. We are not blind to the effects of being obedient in these situations. Christ was not blind to what his obedience meant for him, and we should not be blind to what it means to us either. And one sort of question that comes out of this passage particularly, and it will depend, I'm guessing, on your churchmanship, is the verse, salvation will come to those who obey him. Who obey him. So the question mark there, I suppose, really is, what does that phrase to obey truly mean for us as God's people, and indeed for all people to obey God?
Wow, thank you, Mark. Well, for a passage you didn't want to talk about, you got a lot out of that. I think that's really impressive. I must admit, I was really drawn to the humanity bit and the loud cries and tears, and because we're almost presenting this passage with the two expressions of Christ, aren't we? The glorified Christ and the man of sorrows, and how those are held together. Let me quickly bring in both my other guests so we can get some other reflections on this as well. Andrew, as you listened to Mark and as you read it, where were you stirred as you look at this passage?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have the same questions about obedience and what that means. And Lucy, I'd say something that's perhaps got to do with following. And of course, Jesus says, and going back to that John passage, he says, whoever serves me must follow me. So there's something there about what the purpose of our serving is all about. I don't wish to take away people's homework, but just looking and reflecting on the Melchizedek reference, it goes back to that story in Genesis, I think, where there was a great battle between the kings at the time. So huge kind of forces going on, and that settled down. But in the battle, Lot was taken prisoner, wasn't he? And Abram went in and rescued Lot. He stood up for what was right and righteous. And at the end of it all, when everything is settled down, when the chaos is settled and what have you, Melchizedek comes out and he blesses Abraham and he acknowledges that we're now in a time of peace. And I think our role as priests, whether we're ordained as priests or priests as the people of God, is to bring blessing to people's lives. And when all the chaos around us now comes to a place of settling, to draw people to the peacefulness of what life with God is all about.
Thank you, Andrew. Really appreciate that. I hadn't really clocked that about Melchizedek. Thank you. That's my little gem I'm going to take away today. Yeah, and follow up on. Thank you ever so much. Andy, pearls of wisdom from you on Hebrews, apart from the fact you wouldn't preach on it.
It's really interesting. Were I to preach on it, and almost extraordinarily, I think it follows on really well from Andrew's comment. So one of the other things that I think all of these passages, certainly John and Hebrews, points to or encourages us to think about is a sort of identities of Christ or images of Christ. And as I was running a million miles away from Hebrews and trying to think of how I could possibly make sure I didn't get to do what Mark's done a really good job on, it did strike me that if you had locked me in a room for a long period of time and asked me to come up with every possible image or identity or metaphor for Christ, I'm not sure actually, if I'm honest, I would ever have come to priest. I don't, and it's not something that's ever dawned on me before, so some of you may now be kind of shrieking in horror at this heretic that's here. But God, Lord, Savior, light, bread, water, shepherd, but not priest. And that led me to think about, well, actually, so what is a priest? And I started just googling around and discovered that the more normal Latin word for priest is sacerdos. But also pontifex is another word for priest or high priest. And pontifex actually means bridge builder. And that led me to reflect on actually very much as Andrew was saying, whether the role of us as ministers, let's not get into the priest and ordained and lay ministry discussion, as ministers of God, actually our role is to be bridge builders, and whether the church representation rules represent wall building rather than bridge building on too many occasions.
That sounds like a brilliant place to land our exploration of the scriptures. That was neatly done. Thank you so much. And Chris says exactly, Andy. I'm not quite sure because the time lapse which bit it was exactly Andy, but exactly Andy. We've unpacked the passages as best we can with the time allowed. But I always ask my guests just before we finish to tell us what kind of sermon either they might be planning to write if they are actually preaching on Sunday with the lectionary, or if not, an imagined kind of task. So I'm going to go around my screen. Andrew, up in Castle Donington, are you preaching on Sunday? Yeah, what kind of sermon might be shaping up for you?
I'm not preaching on Sunday as it happens, but we're going through a kind of a sermon series looking at the characteristics of Jesus, and we've sort of looked at the purpose of Jesus, the identity of Jesus, the suffering, all those things that kind of we're drawn to through Lent. And this week, albeit the beginning of Passiontide, we're focusing on the way of Jesus. What is this way of life he calls us to? And so I think that's where, if I were preaching, I'd put in with all those themes of servanthood and of following and of laying down our lives, and put that into that overarching purpose of God all the way through the Bible is to rescue, to restore, to redeem. And I probably learned actually what Andy so helpfully took us to about being bridge builders, people who are makers of peace.
Thanks, Andy. Thank you. No, you're Andrew. The other one's Andy. Let's go to Andy next then. I'll let you unmute yourself, Andy.
Yes, I'm not preaching on Sunday. Were I preaching, then I think I would very much stick with the gospel, sort of backed up by Jeremiah, and really encouraging the congregation to see this kind of upping of the stakes as we move towards Passiontide and then Holy Week, and to encourage them to try as best they can as we move through the stories and the readings in Passiontide and Holy Week, to get a sense of the reality and the pain and the visceral nature of what Jesus did on the cross and his emptying of himself on the cross for us. So relatively traditional treatment, I guess, but I think that is where I'd go with it.
Thanks, Andy. Mark, what about yourself? Are you preaching on Sunday?
I'm not preaching on Sunday. I'm actually taking a Sunday off, which is a rare event. Certainly over the last year has been a rare event. So I'm not preaching. But I think, again, I'd focus predominantly on the John passage, probably linked in with Jeremiah as well. But I think it is that sort of transformational moment. And it's a transformational moment, and that fact that the message of Christ's passion is not just for the people of Jerusalem, of Judah, but of all people, that this is all people becoming interested in this person who is about to, just imagine what it'd be like for the Greeks. Actually, just come to find out who he is, and then all of a sudden he gets hung on a cross. But actually, that is a defining moment, isn't it? Which actually, as he is raised up, will draw all people to myself. So there's that sense of the cross stands as that symbolic image which draws the whole world to him and his self-giving love, because the heart of it all is that self-giving love. So something around those sort of thoughts.
Thank you. And and as we approach Lent, approach Holy Week, focusing our congregation's minds onto where we're heading sounds like a good idea. And we've got a new tradition now here, it would seem. In the comments, we've got some sermon feedback. So Chris says he wouldn't touch Hebrews. Mark's with you on that. Well, no, Andy's with you. And he says it would be John and God's love for and drawing towards of everyone, and reference Jeremiah and love being written in our hearts. And Sue says, I'm not preaching this week. Is anybody preaching this week? I hope somebody is. I'm not preaching this week, but if I did, I would probably go with Andrew and Philip, the bouncers, versus Jesus flinging the doors wide, which for my context, I'm not preaching. We have Suzanne Hanson coming to preach at All Saints, or virtually preaching All Saints, and our theme, following our reconciliation theme, is on radical openness. So if it was me, I guess I would probably be a little bit of what you're saying, Sue, and working with the John's Gospel text and the openness, the radical openness of Jesus to all people. But I think if I had a free rein, I think I would want to preach into the sin of male violence in the particular context we're in now at the minute. And I was really struck by our conversations earlier around law and law being on our hearts, and that kind of transformation that needs to be heard, and would probably want to put both a pastoral and prophetic sermon together. But I haven't got to do that, although maybe I should write it. Maybe I should fit that into my week. Anyway, I want to say thank you so much for my guests joining me today, to Andrew, Mark and Andy, for giving up your time and sharing your wisdom. Thank you for all the comments. It's always great to engage with different people on the scriptures. Next week, I'm back at the same time with two definite guests. I have Elizabeth York, who is chaplain to the Loughborough Schools Foundation. She's returning, and Mohammed Egdadarian, who is intercultural pioneer minister based at Obi. And I thought I had Stuart Burns. He's the director of mission ministry in the Diocese of Leicester, but I've seen a text which might suggest his diary has got a clash. So anyway, either with Stuart or with another mystery guest, join me next week as we take a little look at the lectionary passages and muse together on God's word.